Welcome back to the show, everybody. It's DinaKalmeta here. And for today's news, I'd like to bring you an update concerning some headlines that have occurred in the last few days. For instance, we're going to talk about how Europe is actively preparing for a conflict with Russia. On the other hand, it's being reported that Russia is broadcasting ominous messages from its doomsday radio. There's also been reports that apparently there are Iranian tankers right off of the U.S. coast. And in addition to that, analysts are warning that the United States could face a conflict simultaneously with Russia, Venezuela, Mexico, and China. And there's more. So let's dive into this report.
In Europe, leaders are not whispering anymore. In fact, they're saying it out loud. Prepare for war. NATO's top commander has warned that we must be ready for conflict on the scale our grandparents endured in World War II. Articles across Europe ask the same question. Why is the continent feverishly preparing for World War III? Well, the answer starts with Russia. Moscow has continued with its conflict in Ukraine. But the confrontation is no longer about tanks and trenches. It's nuclear threats, economic warfare, and cyber attacks. Russian media and officials have warned that nuclear alienation is inevitable if the West crosses certain red lines. The UK, they claim, has given Russia casus belli, a legal justification for war, by supplying long-range weapons and supporting what Moscow calls attacks on Russian territory. So how is Europe preparing for a conflict? Well, Europe is experiencing the most aggressive military expansion in more than 30 years. Policymakers aren't simply adding a few extra battalions or refreshing aging equipment. They are rebuilding the continent's defense posture from the ground up, reversing decades of demobilization and budget cuts. Consider just a few of the dramatic shifts underway. France is expanding its army and restoring military service nearly 30 years after ending conscription. While voluntary for now, the move reflects a growing consensus that France needs a significantly larger reserve of trained personnel. Why? If a peace deal with Russia were anywhere on the horizon, such an expansion could be unnecessary. Germany is transforming its military at a pace unseen in its modern history. It plans to dramatically increase the size of its Bundeswehr and pour unprecedented sums into its new weapon systems, advanced defense technologies, and logistic capacity. Next year's defense procurement budget is projected to reach record-breaking levels. And other nations are following suit. Denmark extended its draft to women and lengthened the required service time. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania maintain universal or lottery-based conscriptions, preparing new waves of soldiers annually. Croatia has reinstated a draft that abandoned nearly 2 decades ago. Poland is developing plans to conduct mass-scale military training for adult males, hoping to double the size of its army. Norway has begun reopening Cold War-era bomb shelters and expanding its total defense system, preparing civilians and infrastructure for the possibility of a large-scale conflict with Russia. Sweden is upgrading its vast network of 64,000 wartime shelters and revitalizing national civil defense planning, signaling that it too is bracing for the kind of crisis Europe hoped it would never face again. These moves aren't sporadic. They're coordinated, sudden, simultaneous. When half a continent shifts its military-industrial gear, it's not a coincidence. It's preparation. Meanwhile, hospitals are preparing for tens of thousands of casualties. In France, hospitals have instructed to prepare for a massive armed conflict by early 2026, planning documents that outline scenarios where 10,000 to 50,000 wounded soldiers could require treatment within a few months. Hospitals are being told to expand trauma care capacity, ready supply chains, and coordinate with regional emergency centers in anticipation of wartime conditions. Germany is undertaking similar efforts, quietly updating civil defense frameworks and hospital networks to handle mass injuries in the event of war on European soil. If peace with Russia were imminent, such preparations would be unnecessary, even absurd. But if war is on the horizon, they make perfect sense. The NATO chief's warning that Europe must prepare for conflicts on the scale of the world wars was not a metaphor. Those wars were total conflicts involving entire societies, not just armies. Factories, hospitals, railways, politics, and culture were drawn into the struggle. When he said that Europe must return to a wartime mindset, he meant preparing for exactly that kind of comprehensive challenge. Fully mobilized economies, expansive militaries, hardened infrastructure, civilian readiness, rapid wartime production. The Russians have told us over and over again that they have no intention of going to war with Europe. In fact, the Russian foreign minister said those exact words, but he did warn that there are a couple of red lines that will force the Russians to respond if they crossed it. For instance, sending large numbers of European troops into Ukraine would be a really foolish thing to do because of the Russians' reactions. Now, both of these reports come from Prophecy Newswatch and The Most Important News with Michael Schneider. So Michael goes on to say, and once that starts happening, we will be perilously close to nuclear conflict. This is something that they talk about on Russian television all of the time. Commenting about one British soldier in Ukraine that perished, one of the most prominent voices on Russian television boldly declared that a nuclear strike on Britain is inevitable. That is crazy talk. But this is how they actually see the world. And we should be trying to avoid a worst case scenario while we still can. The expropriation of Russian assets is another red line for the Russians, and it appears that the Europeans are determined to cross it, and I reported on this just last week. Now, at the same time, Russia's so-called doomsday radio has blasted out a series of 15 cryptic messages. These transmissions, believed to be linked to Russia's nuclear command and control system, are often associated with drills, signaling and sometimes with escalatory posturing. In a moment when tensions are already high, that kind of messaging is chilling. And the conflict has gone digital as well. Germany has publicly accused Russia of a cyber attack on its air traffic control systems, reminding us that modern conflicts can paralyze airports, power grids, and financial systems long before a physical conflict actually starts. Meanwhile, political discussions in Washington include the idea of forming a new five-nation grouping with Russia to replace the G7, even as NATO officials are warning about a possible World War scale conflict with that same Russia. Confusion and division in the West is exactly what Moscow studies and seeks to exploit.
So from a prophetic perspective, what matters isn't just one headline, but all the headlines across the board. The fact of the matter is Europe is preparing for war, and we're watching Russia escalate their posture. And it's not a question of if tensions will rise, but where will they spill next. Now, hopefully cooler heads will prevail, but only time will tell. And as always, I'll continue to keep you updated. But I would like to pivot and talk about the Middle East and why Iranian tankers have been seen off the U.S. coast.
Middle East, Iran is pushing its influence on land and at sea. Off the U.S. coast, an ominous fleet of Iranian-linked tankers have sparked serious alarm. These ships could be moving sanctioned oil, serving as probes to test American reactions, or simply as bargaining chips in a much larger confrontation involving Iran, Venezuela, and the U.S. At the same time, U.S. forces have reportedly raided a ship carrying cargo from China to Iran, seizing material that's believed to be used to strengthen Iran's military capabilities. This is more than a single interception. It reveals a China-Iran supply line and shows Washington could be trying to choke off that cooperation on the high seas. But Iran's reach doesn't stop there. Through proxies, militias, and political influence, Iran is involved in conflicts stretching from Yemen to Lebanon to Iraq and Syria, all while threatening Israel with annihilation. Ukraine, in the meantime, is under pressure from both the United States and Iran. Kyiv is looking to revamp its ties with Israel. As Iran grows bolder, Ukraine sees the need for deeper cooperation with Jerusalem, even during its conflict with Russia. This is a picture of a rising anti-Western axis. Iran, Russia, and increasingly China interconnected on the battlefield, in the shipping lanes, and the arms trade.
In the Middle East, we've been watching the prophetic pieces come together for quite some time concerning Iran, Russia, Turkey, their relationship. It's getting stronger and stronger. And then, of course, Israel surrounded by her enemies. This will eventually lead to the Gog-Magog war that we're told about in the book of Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39. So we want to keep a close eye on Israel because she is God's prophetic time clock. But with that said, I would like to move along and talk about another region where one single spark can ignite a global war. It's the triangle between the United States, Taiwan, and China, and now with Japan in the middle. And if this war were to start, it would change everything for the United States.
In Asia, the center of gravity is shifting towards a potential conflict over Taiwan. A reported top-secret Chinese war planning document lays out how Beijing believes it could crush U.S. forces in the region, including detailed scenarios for destroying the world's largest aircraft carrier, America's crown jewel or power projection. Analysts warn that if this conflict breaks out over Taiwan, the transformation to the American life would be instant. Disrupted supply chains, vanished electronics and pharmaceuticals, energy shocks, financial turmoil, and the potential hit to the U.S. power grid and satellite networks. And that last part is not hypothetical. Reports indicate that a single Chinese-made device in America's infrastructure could serve as a backdoor into the U.S. power grid, which points to Beijing quietly positioning itself to sabotage critical systems in the event of a conflict. Against this backdrop, the skies over Japan and the Western Pacific are growing crowded. U.S. strategic bombers were seen flying alongside Japanese anti-ship fighters, rehearsing how to stop Chinese naval forces. A mysterious U.S. military jet has been spotted in Japan as Washington deploys more advanced assets to the region. At the same time, U.S. strategic bombers and Japanese forces are operating amid rising tension, not only with China, but also with Russia, which shares a maritime frontier with Japan and its own disputes in the region. Every exercise, every overflight, every naval patrol is a test. Who will blink first? From a prophetic perspective, this region shows us how quickly the rumors of war Jesus spoke about can turn into actual wars that reshape global trade, crash economies, and cause fear to grip nations. It's no accident that much of the world's commerce passes through this theater, and a war here wouldn't just be regional, it would be global. Meanwhile, in America, tensions are stacking up in a way that could open a southern front few are prepared for. U.S. forces recently carried out a dramatic airborne operation, storming a Venezuelan tanker and seizing control of the ship. This followed earlier seizures of Venezuelan oil tankers by U.S. warships, fueling fears that Washington is moving toward a de facto blockade. And President Trump has sent a fierce four-word warning to Colombia's president after the seizure of a Venezuelan ship, signaling that Washington expects its regional partners to fall in line with its pressure campaign against Venezuela. And what's even more startling is that some U.S. politicians are now claiming that Russia may have nuclear-related capabilities tied to Venezuela, raising the specter of Russian weapons or support being positioned in the Western Hemisphere, recalling the echoes of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Moscow, for its part, has doubled down on support for Nicolas Maduro. Putin has held calls with the Venezuelan leader, publicly backing him after U.S. forces seized the oil tanker. And this sends a clear message. An attack on Maduro's regime is not just an issue with Venezuela, it's an issue with Moscow. In the meantime, Maduro appeared on television, singing, dancing, and threatening to smash the teeth of the North American empire, all while his regime deepens ties with Russia, Iran, and possibly even China. Cuba is also feeling the heat. U.S. seizures of oil tankers are putting Cuba's already fragile supply at risk, which could push them even further into alignment with Moscow and Venezuela as it searches for reliable energy. So let's zoom out. Analysts are warning that in a worst-case spiral, the United States could find itself facing Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, Russia, and China all at the same time, through a combination of direct conflict, proxy wars, cyber attacks, and economic disruption. Add to this a report warning that China will be extremely upset if a U.S. blockade stops Venezuelan oil from reaching it. U.S. commandos raiding ships carrying cargo from China to Iran. Ongoing clashes and ceasefire negotiations in place like Thailand and Cambodia that demand U.S. diplomatic and military attention. And over all of this, one more element. Trump reportedly giving Ukraine a deadline until Christmas to accept a peace deal as Washington tries to wind down one theater even while others threaten to ignite. This is what a multi-front crisis looks like before it fully erupts. Shipping lanes contested, oil flows weaponized, nuclear-armed powers backing proxies in our own hemisphere, and threats at the border and off our coast.
So in conclusion, we have Europe and Russia on a collision course. In the Middle East, they're triggering Bible prophecy. Over in Asia, they're facing a showdown with a superpower over Taiwan, and the United States could potentially see itself in a conflict simultaneously with Russia, Venezuela, Mexico, and China. Jesus told us in the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke that we would hear of wars and rumors of wars. Nation would rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And that is exactly what we are seeing right now. But I want to hear from you guys. Which one of these reports today concerns you the most? Let me know in the comments. Also, when you have some time, come and visit me on my social media pages, as well as my website at www.cww7news.com. All right, everybody, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, God bless and stay safe.